All right, whenever you're ready.
Thank you all very much. It is a pleasure for me to be with you once again. And today we are going to talk about the universal laws. It's a topic that I think is important to understand, and that will help us to understand even better, the next talk, which I think will be one of the most important, right, of the course, which is the talk on acceptance, right, of reality and the will of God. So when, let's see, about the universal laws, they have been discussed in all human spiritual traditions, right? This is in the perennial philosophy of humanity. It's in the Kybalion, and even in the Christian tradition, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, it talks, on several occasions about the fulfillment of the law, right? And what we are going to try to explain is what are these laws, or this law, this universal law, right? Of course, the Old and New Testament speak about the fulfillment of the law, which is the law of love, right? As we will see now. But I think that for our understanding of how the universe works, it is also good to try to talk about the other laws, right, that derive from the law of love and that affect our lives, right? One rightly said that I have enumerated 7 laws, but of course, not saying that the topic of the laws can't be explained in another way, or that other authors or people might divide them into 5 or 10 or so on, right? Because these things, I believe they allow for different possible classifications, don't they? But this dividing it into these 7 laws that I'm going to try to explain today, well, it's something that helped me, to understand it in some way mentally, and to help me, follow the laws, emphasizing that it is not the only one, a possible explanation, right? And you can find other explanations from other authors or in other texts, right? Let's see. The first thing we need to remember is that in the previous sessions, we have seen how many spiritual teachers or even doctors of the church, right, in the case of the Christian tradition, have always asserted that everything that happens happens by the will of God, right? And that not a leaf moves from, a tree with the wind without that being the will of God. For example, in the Catholic Church, I mentioned Alfonso Ligorio, right, who is one of the doctors of the church, that he says verbatim, right, in a little book he has called Conformity with the Will of God, right, that, we should never attribute either to the devil or to men the evils or goods that happen to us, since all evils and goods come from God, right? Regardless of whether he uses instruments that seem appropriate for those things to somehow happen, right? So we can affirm that in the universe, everything that happens by law, right? And nothing that happens in the universe can go beyond the universal laws, because otherwise the universe would become disorganized. And if God, one of the attributes we have always, let's say, granted to God is omniscience. And of course, an omniscient being does not, let's say, lose control of creation, right? Maybe Genesis, which is a book that explains that symbolically, the creation gets everything right, doesn't it? But there's a phrase from Genesis that I like less, which says that on the 6th day, God rested, right? I believe that God did not rest, that creation is continuous, right? And that furthermore, this idea of continuous creation or emergence is what resolves the conflict between intelligent creation and evolution, right? I mean, because it includes both. That's why we talk about continuous creation, because from our point of observation here, it seems like evolution. It really occurs first in consciousness and then manifests in the world of form, doesn't it? That's why, even for me, evolution is a continuous creation, isn't it? And I think that understanding it this way will help us a lot in understanding reality, right? So we can say that all the phenomena that occur in the universe occur or are governed by mathematically exact laws, right? God does not make mistakes. nor does creation slip out of his control, right? And certainly, creation is not governed by an emotional or capricious God. And of course, it does not happen by chance, does it? And we can define the universal law as the immutable principles, right, that govern the order of the universe and the processes of creation and understanding of the universe, right? Therefore, the law is universal, and the only personal thing is the degree of understanding, right, that each of us has about those laws, right? And sure, the first question that I think will come to everyone's mind before continuing is, well, listen, if you just said that everything that happens in the universe happens by law and nothing can happen outside the law, then we continuously observe, right, that murders, crimes, natural disasters, wars occur. And we have to ask ourselves, how can that be within the law of love, right? It's a logical question, and it's the first question that came to my mind when I started studying this topic, you know? Of course, this is fundamentally the famous question of why bad things happen to good people, isn't it? Which theologians have not been able to resolve well so far, right? And we have to say, so that everything else that is said afterward makes sense, that everything that happens in the universe has a purpose of love, right? I mean, God is love, and therefore nothing that happens in the universe falls outside, right, of that law of love or that purpose of love. What we have to understand is that these laws, you know, that govern creation and also govern the understanding of creation by the children of God, which is us, right? These laws are aimed at the growth of the soul, right? Not to the perseverance of the body, right? Notice that this is stated, for example, in the gospel in several places, right? Even the very hairs of your head are all numbered, for example. Huh? I don't think it leaves much room for chance, right? Or for coincidence. We also know that even from science, for example, Einstein said a very famous phrase, which is, coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous, right? Also in the gospel, it tells us, do not worry about those who harm the body, they cannot harm the soul. It tells us more, if something in your body obstructs the evolution of the soul, then tear it out, right? And it also tells us that disasters and tribulations will come, but not to worry, because they are necessary. Of course, necessary for what? Not for the preservation of the body, but for the evolution of the soul, right? This is a point at which, in my humble opinion, this Christian view of giving so much importance to the body, well, it has to change, right? Because if not, we cannot explain what happens. How many times have hundreds of millions of people died in wars or natural disasters? If the children of God were really the bodies, then I believe that God would take care of them a little more, right? And since God does take care of the soul, then we have to understand that these universal laws are aimed at the evolution in consciousness of the soul, not the preservation of bodies. That's why the question of why bad things happen to good people, the question is poorly phrased, because nothing bad ever happens to good people if by people we mean souls, right? Of course, a traffic accident is bad for the body, but not necessarily for the soul. A serious illness endangers the body, but it can be very good for the soul. How many testimonies I have from people that have experienced serious illnesses, and that has helped them transform, right? To understand life in a different way, to change their purposes, or even people who, without having suffered it themselves, have had loved ones who did. And that has also helped them to grow spiritually, right? Therefore, it's important to understand that, as Saint Basil and other spiritual teachers have said, physical planets are schools for souls, right? Of course, we have to value the body and be grateful for it and respect it and take care of it, because it is a great gift from God, so that the soul can have a vehicle for growth when it is incarnated, right? But we cannot fail to understand, for God, the soul is much more important than the body, right? And that's why the only way to understand what happens in life, is to understand that many times you have to put the body in danger, right? Somehow, so that the soul can have its experiences of growth, otherwise it's not understood what happens, right? Or else it couldn't happen. And so, of course, well, why does the war in Ukraine, which is causing so many deaths, so much suffering, occur? Well, like Auschwitz or like many other situations, they are somehow already foretold in the gospel, right? And wars and tribulations will come, but do not worry, because they are necessary. This leads us, of course, to have a much more spiritual view of reality, where we realize that our true reality is the spiritual one and not the physical one. The physical is only provisional while the soul is incarnated, right? To have a growth experience, isn't it? Okay, we can make some postulates, right? A few postulates about the laws of the universe to begin their explanation, right? One of the postulates is that everything that is within the law, right, works well and flows on its own, right? Going with the universal law is like swimming with the current, right? And it makes much more sense and is much smarter, and we use much less energy than if we try to swim against the current, right? Another postulate of the law of the universe is that everything we need, right, we will have, and it is guaranteed by the law. But be careful, it's everything we need for our spiritual growth, not for our ego-driven whims, right? If a person doesn't need a red Ferrari for their spiritual growth, well, they won't have one, right? But if they need it for their spiritual growth for some incomprehensible reason, well, they'll have it, right? Because let's say that the universe guarantees us that everything we need for our spiritual growth will be given and is guaranteed by law. Now, the important thing to understand here is that everything I want but I don't need is outside the law and causes suffering, right? Notice that human beings always want many things, right? The one who is short wants to be tall. The one who has an ugly nose wants it to be pretty. The one who doesn't have money wants to have money. The one who has money doesn't want to lose it, health, and so on, right? Human beings are always full of wants, aren't we? But if we do not need that desire, right, for our spiritual growth, then it will not be given to us. And hence the need to accept reality, as we will discuss in the next session, right? Therefore, we have to know that everything we have is because we need it. And if not, life would not give it to us, right? It is true that humans, in their evolution, have to learn many things to be happy in wealth and poverty, in health and sickness, right? And in many different circumstances, because we have to learn the unwavering peace of the soul in the face of external things, okay? And therefore, in different experiences, we will have different circumstances to be able to make all that learning, right? Another important thing is that we need to learn to appreciate, right, what we do have, instead of always focusing on what we don't have, right? Because if we don't value what we have, we are on the path to losing it by universal law, right? And that too is, it needs to be understood. That's why understanding these universal laws and their functioning is very important, because spiritual understanding has more strength than willpower, right? And in that sense, as we come to better understand why things happen and how creation takes place, right? We will need less willpower because we will have more understanding. Willpower is sometimes there, sometimes not. It depends on the day, right? And the biorhythms, but understanding is always there and allows us, well, to adapt, to the circumstances in a way. And let's say with less energy expenditure, so to speak, than truth, that willpower, that voluntarism. If everything happens by law, right, another question we need to answer before looking more closely at how these laws work is the famous question of human freedom, isn't it? It is evident that God has made his children free because love is not made by imposition, right? But rather by invitation or by inspiration, correct? It is taught that way. And therefore, it is true that human beings have a degree of freedom, right? So that because we are also allowed to make mistakes against the lower laws, right? To learn, right? The consequences of not following the law. The first thing we have to say in that sense is that the human being has two types of freedom, if we think about it, right? We have a freedom that is internal, which is what allows me to react as I want in the face of external circumstances. And in principle, that freedom is unlimited. The only limitation it has is internal freedom is limited by our level of consciousness, as we saw in the previous lesson. Because a person with a higher level of consciousness has more freedom internally to react to events in a more appropriate way, while lower levels of consciousness operate more animalistically, more reactively, right? We explained the different functioning of the brain at both levels, and that's why inner freedom is less, because it is more conditioned, right? In some way. For example, a dog has less freedom interior than us because it is more dominated by its instincts, right? And if you put a plate of food in front of it, or a female dog in heat crosses its path, it's more difficult to control a dog than an evolved human being, right? So we also have to understand that a human being has an external freedom, which is how I can perform outside myself the actions or performances that I want to do, right? And generally, the universe, God, right, respects the external freedom of the human being, except that disrupts the universe, right? That goes against universal laws, in which case the external freedom of the human being can become limited. For example, there have been cases where a person tried to shoot another person and the gun jammed, and we have said, oh, what luck, or such good luck, right? When we all know that luck doesn't exist in the universe. That has always been stated by all spiritual traditions, and it's now said by modern scientists, isn't it? Therefore, if there is no luck or chance, we have to recognize that everything is governed by laws, and that therefore, if I want to shoot a person, but that person, as we will see, is not meant to receive that outcome by law, my gun will jam or something else will happen, but I won't be able to shoot them, right? Therefore, our external freedom is not absolute, but is limited by law, right? I insist the ability to make mistakes is not outside the law, right? Mistakes are made against the lower laws, which we will discuss now, but that possibility of violating the lower laws is included in the higher laws, right? We will see that universal laws are hierarchical. What does that mean? That higher laws can modify lower ones, but not the other way around. Okay, a lower law cannot modify a higher law. And that, yes, we have to understand it. But of course, the way to learn the laws, it is making mistakes, right? Because whenever we break universal laws, the results we get will not be pleasant, right? And it's how we learn it. For example, we learn physical laws. A child, for example, can stick a finger into a flame, but will do it once. No? When they see the blister that forms, they will learn not to put fingers into the flames. Just like we learn not to jump off house roofs to the ground, because we know the law of gravity exists, right? And we could have quite a fall, no? So it's learned, right? The existence of laws through making mistakes by not following them, right? And see the results that it produces for us, right? Because we said it at the beginning of the session, everything that is in favor of the law always yields good fruit. Notice also, that was another central teaching of the gospel, wasn't it? When they asked Jesus,
How will we distinguish the good prophets from the bad prophets, or the good ideas from the bad ideas? And Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them, because everything that is aligned with the law of love always bears good fruit, right? And what is not aligned with the law of love, which is the main law of the universe, never bears good fruit, right? Therefore, observe the fruits, right? What we experience in life will give us a good idea of how much we are following the universal laws on each occasion, right? We also have to say that the higher laws govern creation, right? And the lower laws govern the understanding of creation by the children of God, don't they? And then if you agree with these, let's say, initial explanations, let's move on to try to give an explanation of what these laws are like or how they work. We will start from the superior to reach the inferior, and insisting once again that it's not the only way to explain them. That maybe someone comes up with a better way to explain them, and that well, we have to be open to other possibilities of understanding. But seeing them in this way that I am now going to suggest, I think it will help all of us quite a bit, right? Well, to understand them, and in some way, well, to place ourselves under them, right? Which is what will finally free us from suffering, right? Because suffering, we have often said, is the mental resistance to what happens, at least mental suffering. I am not referring to physical pain. That's another thing, right? So if we see the laws this way, we can say that there are 7 universal laws, right? Or 7 laws in the universe. And the top 3 don't affect us much yet, because we are not yet at the level of creators, right? And therefore, well, it's good to know them, but they don't directly affect our lives. The higher law is the law of love, right? God is love. And therefore, everything that happens in the universe has a purpose of love, right? Even though it may seem to us from this point of observation, from this dimension, that sometimes things are very harsh, everything has a purpose of love. A little in a similar way, when I had the small children or grandchildren that I have now, of course, sometimes parents have to punish them a bit, right? I mean, it's not punishment, but rather, well, make them see that through certain actions or paths, they will not bear good fruits, right? And therefore, they have a pedagogical intention, right? The laws do not have an intention to punish us, do they? Rather, they have an intention to teach us love, right? Of course, for us to fully and deeply understand love is impossible, right? From this level of consciousness. But we can understand many aspects of love, right? And here, remember that we are not referring to egoic or sentimental affection, as we already discussed in a previous lesson, because it is not a feeling, right? Love is not an emotion. Love is an understanding, isn't it? Of the processes, right? Evolutionary and pedagogical of the universe, isn't it? Therefore, if we talk about the higher law, which is the law of love, then we know that love is the origin, right? Of everything that occurs in the universe, and moreover, that understanding love is what frees us from all suffering, right? And this is the higher law, which is then manifested through other laws, isn't it? Well, the other 2 higher laws, we could call, to name them somehow, the law of manifestation and the law of polarity. Why? Because the law of manifestation is what allows the already existing information to manifest. In other words, the law of love is what holds all the information of the universe, right? But it is unmanifested, because God is an unmanifested being, isn't it? And the first emanation of the absolute, so to speak, of God is the law of manifestation, right? Which is what allows everything in creation to manifest, isn't it? And when it manifests with through a law that we have called polarity, right? Because it manages a little the interaction and integration of the masculine and feminine principles in the universe, you know? The masculine principle as the emitting principle, and the feminine principle as a receptive principle, right? For example, to create a figure, you have to make a mold, correct? That could be the receiver, but then you pour a substance into it, that it is the emitter that fits into that mold to produce a figure, right? Therefore, for creation to occur, there must be a law that allows the manifestation of the unmanifested, and there must be a law of polarity, right? Which operates by the principle of attraction of opposites, right? Hey, the bright complements the dark, or the rough with the smooth, right? Well, I'm not going to dwell more on these laws because I insist that I think they affect us less. It's good that we know they exist, but well, at a later stage of our evolution, when we are maybe creators, well, we will already know them, right? But I think we are more interested in focusing on the four, let's say, lower laws, right, that govern the understanding of creation by the children of God. Okay, well, the highest of these four lower laws, I call, for lack of a better term, the law of evolution, right? And some of the postulates of this law of evolution are the following, right? Only experience allows us to know the truth, okay? Things need to be verified to achieve a deep understanding. You shouldn't just believe them, you need to verify them. If we believe them but do not verify them, then we have not yet reached wisdom. I mean, we will have good intellectual knowledge, we will have good scholarship, but wisdom demands verification, right? And therefore, this is important. Only experience, right, allows us to know the truth. Another postulate of this law of evolution is that the human being only encounters events that must be understood and transcended. And that the third postulate is that the need of the soul, it has to evolve, right? It is the only reason for the existence of physical worlds. And we have to keep that in mind, okay? So let's see. If we compare the school of the universe with what would be, for example, a university, a school of earth, we would say that the law of evolution is the one that sets the curriculum. Remember that in the third session, we talked about the levels of consciousness. So the curriculum that souls have to evolve spiritually is that passing through those levels of consciousness, right? So, for example, the law of evolution, for example, would be equivalent to a faculty of law, right? So the faculty meets and says, well, for students to graduate, they need to learn international law, administrative law, criminal law. In short, a series of subjects that the students need to learn in some way in order to graduate, right? Like lawyers. Therefore, the law of evolution is what sets the curriculum that all souls have to go through, right? They have to go through it in order to graduate from this school, right, of spiritual experience. And therefore, it determines the learning processes that we all have to follow, right? It is the law that takes us from the initial innocence of the souls through a series of greater or lesser ignorances to reach wisdom, right? And therefore, it is the law that governs over all the others in this process of understanding creation, okay? Then, after the law of evolution would come the law of correspondence, okay? And the law of correspondence would be the one that determines all the details, right? The details through which each of us has to learn what the law of evolution requires us to learn, right? For example, if we compare it to a university on Earth, well, the law of correspondence is the one that would say, yes, this student has to learn international law at 5 in the afternoon in classroom 2B with Professor so-and-so, right? That is the law of correspondence. It creates specific details for each of us, right? Through which we have to go through the curriculum that the law of evolution requires us to learn, right? So, for example, the correspondence one determines the space, the place, the time. The function of all beings determines what our genetic characteristics are, right? With the physical body we will have at birth. We will be men, we will be women, we will have a physical defect or not, or some genetic disease that can help us transcend the ego more quickly. For example, the choice of parents, right? And this is determined by the law of correspondence. All souls, before incarnating, one of the first things they do is choose the parents, right, that we will have. And not because parents are perfect, right, but because they are the perfect ones we need for our experience, even if they are deficient, right? But it is precisely their deficiencies as parents that will also help us, so that we can grow spiritually in a faster way by facing that situation and learning from it, right? So all events, absolutely all events that happen in the universe happen to the people who are in line with those events, right? For example, notice that when an earthquake occurs, there are always some people who leave the area the day before and others who arrive the day before and experience the earthquake, right? When a plane crashes, all the people on the plane are corresponding with that accident, right? Even sometimes things have happened that we have labeled as miracles, right? But you know that St. Augustine said that miracles do not happen against the laws of the universe, but against what we know about the laws of the universe. Because St. Augustine also wrote and spoke quite a bit about the laws, right? So, for example, a plane crash where everyone dies except one person, right? And people say, well, it's inexplicable because this accident was not survivable, right? But one person survived, okay? And we say, how lucky they were. No, it's that that person was not meant to die in that accident for reasons that only God would know in his, let's say, with the care of evolutionary processes or of souls, right? Therefore, all situations, says the law of correspondence, are learning experiences, right? And all the circumstances of our external life, in some way, we generate them from within, right? Because our inner self determines what lessons we must have or not have, right? Let's say when we learn things, we rise in the level of consciousness because the law of correspondence will prepare other lessons suitable for our new level, and we will no longer need the old ones. But the law of correspondence does have a very important postulate, which is everything that is resisted persists, because everything that is not accepted must happen again in some way for us to learn to accept it, right? Therefore, do not be guided by the statements, sometimes from less serious spirituality, that say we can create reality with our thoughts. That is not really true, right? We create reality through our need for learning. Of course, thought can influence or not influence our need for learning, but there have been many books, as you all know, in the United States and other places like The Secret and some others that say, no, you visualize a red Ferrari and it will appear in your garage. No. Let's see, there has been a lot of frustration with that because it is consciousness that creates reality, not our thoughts. As we saw in the first sessions, consciousness vibrates faster than thought and has more causative power, right? It is our need for growth that indirectly creates our reality, because everything that is going to happen to us is what we need to grow. And to the extent that we have already learned the lesson, we will not repeat that teaching in principle, because the universe is very efficient and it does not waste energy, right? Nor events that are not necessary for the growth of the people who suffer them, right? Or who experience them, right? Of course, this brings us to touch on another important topic, which is the topic of determinism, right? Of course, this is a paradox, right? Because on one side, if God is omniscient, then God is eternal. Remember that eternity does not mean a very long time, but outside of time. Well, evidently in God, there is no surprise, because for there to be surprise, there must be sequence, right? If there is no sequence, there is no surprise. Therefore, God already knows everything we are going to decide or not decide, how we are going to use our freedom before it happens, and combines everything so that the whole universe is organized in an exact way, right? For the spiritual growth of all, right? The living beings who are children of God. Therefore, we could say that from God's perspective, everything is determined. That is, if God is an omniscient being, it cannot be otherwise, right? Now, what we also have to understand is that from our point of observation, from here, from the third dimension, everything is indeterminable. Okay? And remember that in the old paradigm, we could only think in terms of either or. It's darkness or light, but not both at the same time, right? Good or bad, but not both at the same time. Whereas the new paradigm thinks in terms of and. For example, in past centuries, there have been great discussions about whether God was transcendent or immanent, until we realized that the discussion is trivial, because it is both at the same time. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, right? So the same thing happens a bit with this, doesn't it? We have to understand that from God's point of view. Everything is determined, but from our point of observation, everything is indeterminable, okay? And therefore, there is no conflict in that matter, right? So, well, we have explained the law of evolution. We have explained the one that follows, which is the law of correspondence. And we always have to know that in the place we are, in the group we belong to, we are always there by mathematically exact correspondence, right? And this is the law that when we rise in level of consciousness, it removes, right, the events we needed before to grow, and gives us new ones that we now need to grow from our new level, right? Let's see. Below, beneath the law of correspondence, we have what we could call the law of harmony, right? What is the law of harmony? Well, it is the law that integrates all the parts into a whole, right? It's the law that explains that everything you emit, right, reacts and returns, right? Because, of course, keep in mind that human beings are beings of light. We emit energy, right, continuously. Proof that we emit energy is we emit heat, right? We all know that if 40 people enter a small room at once, after a short time, that room will increase by 2 degrees in temperature, right? And that's because human beings emit energy, right? We also know that if we get lost at the North Pole, right? Well, sleeping huddled together allows us in some way to retain warmth, doesn't it? It's what penguins do in Antarctica, for example. If you've seen the movie, in some documentary, you know, like National Geographic or whatever, right? So the law of harmony also says that everything that is attacked defends itself, right? And that it is the law that manifests when we are all capable of living together with tolerance, with respect, right? And without violence. And when we experience stress, right, or difficulties in relationships and emotional conflicts and all those kinds of things, well, in some way, we are violating that law without knowing it, right? For example, I can say that when I was a younger man, I had no idea, right, about the existence of these laws, and not even, let's say, I had them in my understanding, right? And therefore, when I acted with the best possible criteria. But now that I understand the laws and their functioning and look back on my life, I realize perfectly that everything everything that has gone well for me in life, it's because I followed the law without knowing it, because I didn't know it, right? And everything that has gone wrong in my life or not as I expected, is because I violated the universal law without knowing it too, because I didn't know them, right? Because somehow ignorance of the law does not exempt you from its compliance or their effects. And therefore, that is why it is important for us to understand them and learn to follow them, right? And lastly, the most basic law, right, of the universe, among the 7 laws, is what we would call the law of nature, isn't it? And some of the postulates of the law of nature are this, aren't they? All natural manifestations require adequate conditions. All violations of the law have their consequences, don't they? For example, if I drink 5 bottles of whiskey every day, I am somehow going against the law of nature, because that is not a drink that suits the body. And therefore, I might end up with cirrhosis, right? After a while, just as an example, right? And we follow this law of nature, well, when we act on instinct, right? Instinct is made to generate and protect life and maintain it, right? And defend it. And well, all beings have their specific function, right? Within this law of nature. And they are aware of this law in their instinctive body, right? Just like all natural cycles, they have their specific function. And this law is a horizontal law that in some way it acts on the dense realms of matter. If this were the only law that existed, well, Darwin probably would have been right, you know? But of course, Darwin didn't take into account the other higher laws, and that's why now we all know that evolution or creation, let's say, doesn't occur like that, right? So notice that the lower laws can be violated by making bad use of our freedom, precisely so that we learn, right, to follow the law and to understand and obey it, don't we? And we learn it by having bad results. So I'm going to give a silly example, okay? Homosexuality, for example, of course, it goes against the law of nature, but it does not go against the higher laws, right? If homosexuality is possible, then although it violates the law of nature, it's because it is necessary for certain learnings, right? And therefore, it is allowed by the law of evolution or by the law of correspondence, right? I believe that absolutizing the lower laws is one of the great mistakes humanity has made in its metaphysics, right? Because we have lacked the understanding that we are allowed to make mistakes by violating lower laws, correct? For us to evolve spiritually and better understand the law, right? So the only law that should be absolutized, in my opinion, is the law of love, right? And all other lower laws, they can be violated in some way, and that is permitted by the higher law, which is the law of love, or from the, and if we are talking about the 4 lower laws, the violation of the law of harmony or nature or correspondence is allowed by the law of evolution so that we can learn from those errors and the consequences of breaking those laws, right? Evidently, when we violate the law of nature, we usually do not get good results, do we? We can harm our health, for example, by eating or drinking things that are not good for us, or we can deteriorate our health by not getting enough sleep or not resting. In short, by not observing the law of nature for ourselves, right? Because we have a physical body. We can violate the law of harmony every time we engage in egotistical arguments, disrespect, intolerance, and we see that when that happens, well, the result that occurs in the world is not what we would like, right? And we see it there with the continuous wars and with the conflicts and the inability to reach agreements, right? Which is what makes life very inefficient, you know? Because in the world, there isn't a lack of resources, but a lack of efficiency in the distribution of those resources, right? And we see it every time, right? In all things. Therefore, the first consequence that we suffer when we do not respect the universal laws is that the universe, the planet becomes inefficient. That is the first consequence, right? And of course, everything that is inefficient uses more energy than it should, doesn't it? To achieve the goals we set, right? And perhaps another thing we could mention is for us to observe how we are fulfilling the law or obeying the law. We should observe a series of results in our lives, right? And that will indicate to us to what extent we are following the law or not. These results, I like to divide them into internal results and external results, right? The internal results are our peace, our happiness, and our attitude of service. If we are at peace, if we are happy, if we have an attitude of service, we will know that we are obeying the law, that we are under the law, right? And I would also like us to observe 4 external results, right? Such as the quality of our human relationships, our abundance, our adaptability to the environment, and our health, right? If we observe these 4 external results, we will also be observing to what extent we are following or not, let's say, the universal laws, right? We also have to keep in mind that there are souls that are braver than others. You know, I like to say that the soul has 2 levels of freedom, right? One first up there where we accept the script that is proposed to us for this course, like of evolution that we undergo in the physical world, and another level of freedom, which is once we are already here and we have forgotten it or are not aware of it, how we use our freedom to live out the course in practice, right? Of course, when it comes to daring with certain scripts or others, well, some souls are braver than others, you know? And sometimes we have to understand that there are very difficult situations in life that people experience, but they are brave souls, right? Who dare to take courses that for others would be more complicated or that they would ponder, for example, right, for a longer time to do them. While there are souls like, let's say, students on earth, and some apply themselves more in school than others, and that's why they go faster or can even skip grades or whatever, right? And so one of the things we have to understand is that many times those difficult circumstances are not really a misfortune, but an opportunity for the soul to take a faster course or 2 courses in one, right? However, we want to understand it. Therefore, I think we need to see it from that perspective. We have to close this presentation of the laws by saying that it is extremely important that we can reflect on this, that we must observe, learn the laws through the mistakes and see the consequences of the mistakes we make. There is no other way to do it because it has to be experiential knowledge, and we must have the peace of mind that nothing happens against the law of love, that the universe does not become disorganized, and that we, with our freedom, can make mistakes, violate the laws, and from that we will learn to follow them, because no one wants to have unsatisfactory results in their lives, right? And if you are interested, the 2nd chapter of my first book, because we will not have enough time in this session to cover it, the first book dedicated 2 chapters to the topic of universal laws. The first one explains them in a similar way to how I have explained them today. But then there's a 2nd chapter, right, that talks about the practical application, right, of the laws in daily life, right? And there we talk about the law of warning, right, that we have to be vigilant. We talk about the law of opportunity, right? How many times the universe gives us opportunities that we do not pursue for various reasons, due to fears or things, right? The law of communicating vessels, cause and effect, which is karma, desaturation, right? Because many times, many people are only focused on spiritual growth because they are tired of suffering and need to find a solution. I would say that 99% of people get into the spiritual path more out of saturation than inspiration, right? Well, seeing how these laws apply to daily life is also useful. And I have a chapter in the book dedicated to that, in case any of you might be interested in looking at it, right? But the important thing is to understand how these laws generally work. And we also need to be willing to obey and follow them, right? Because where human laws can be changed, where they can be modified, universal laws are immutable and cannot be changed, they cannot be modified. Whenever we go against them, we will have, let's say, undesirable results, right? Well, I think I have already spent the 50 or 55 minutes I have for the explanation. And if you want, we can move on to see if there are any questions, or in short, anything that was unclear or that we can clarify more during the Q&A. So I'll give the floor to Juan so that he can ask those that seem most appropriate. Okay, over to you, Juan.
Thank you, Gonzalo. There are questions. There are questions from.
I suppose so.
Yes, yes. And there are several.
Let's see. There are several asking about predestination.
Yes.
I know you have already talked about the topic, but since there are several questions, it's about whether there really is predestination if we have freedom. For example, Elena asks, if everything happens because God wants it, where does man's freedom stand?
Well, you see, the freedom of man, when what God wants happens, a person can react to what happens in one way or another, right? For example, I have a serious traffic accident. I lose a loved one. That happened because God willed it, obviously, right? Now, how I react to that accident where I lose a loved one, that is within my inner freedom, correct? It is true that God already knows how I am going to react, but I do not. Okay? So all our inner freedom to react to, in one way or another, to what God ordains, that's part of our freedom. In fact, if I do not react to events with acceptance or in the correct way to react to them, they will keep happening until I learn to react properly, until I learn to use my inner freedom to unite my will with the will of God, which is what our inner freedom is for, right? But of course, until I learn to be completely united with the will of God, well, sometimes I won't react to certain events in an appropriate way, in the law of love, right? In a loving way. And therefore, those events can keep repeating themselves in one way or another until I learn that, right? That's why I said that one of the postulates of the law of correspondence is that everything you resist persists, right? It's a great spiritual saying. Of course, I have external freedom, as we said before, to kick someone, right? But if that someone should not receive the kick because it is not corresponding to receive it, the universal law will somehow paralyze my leg. I mean, I can never cause harm to another person if that other person is not also corresponding by law to receive that harm, right? And that will help both of us grow. I will have to learn that I will not achieve peace and happiness by harming others. And the harmed person will also have to learn to react appropriately, forgive that harm, and act from the law of love, right? Therefore, everything is interconnected. So that's why I say that this paradox that everything is determined, but at the same time indeterminable, from our point of observation, is something we have to understand, right? Because if not, we have all these doubts like, well, why? Because when we have all these doubts, it's because our mind, the mind, right? Can only think in terms of opposites, right? And saying that everything is determined, but indeterminable at the same time, is something that the mind struggles with a lot because the mind is dual, right? And it works in dualism and says it has to be one thing or the other, right? But we can realize that it's both things at the same time. And the only thing that varies between God and us is the point of observation, right? So from my point of view, everything is indeterminable because I do not know what will happen in the future. And I can think with my mind, of course, that people's freedom can lead things one way or another, right? But of course, from God's point of view, everything is determined because it is instantaneous. I mean, there is no sequence because there is no time and therefore no surprise. And both ideas, they can be understandable, but we have to understand that from contemplative eyes rather than from the mental eyes of reason. Because the mental eyes of reason, of course, can only work in classification, categorization, opposites, and they are dualistic. That's why we said in our second session, I think we explained the idea that the mind cannot see essence, it can only see appearance, right? So if the mind is very sophisticated, it can see very sophisticated appearance, but it cannot see essence. That is reserved for the eyes of final contemplation or to intuition, not to reason, right? And I think this is the best way to answer that question.
Thank you, Gonzalo. We also have a couple of questions about suicide, about whether suicide violates higher laws and if it goes against the will of God.
Let's see. Suicide obviously is not something that is aligned with the law of love, because the first thing we have to do in order to commit suicide is not accept reality and want to escape from it, right? Because at that moment, well, it seems very costly to us, right? Suicide is never good for spiritual evolution because it essentially makes us repeat the course, right, in some way. But suicide is within the law of love, or it couldn't happen. Do you understand? Nothing that happens is outside the law. The universe, it of course, instinct leads you to preserve life. So we could say that suicide is against the law of nature, right? We don't often see animals committing suicide, right? So suicide is not in the instinct, right? To commit suicide, you have to use the mind and have some ideas and some emotional or mental problems that lead you to take that step, right? But it is not encoded in the law of instinct. Therefore, we could say that suicide goes against the lower laws, which is why it doesn't produce good fruit, right? But it doesn't go against the law of love, because otherwise it couldn't happen. So once again, suicide is a learning experience that slows down your evolution. That's fundamentally the seriousness of suicide, isn't it? It's like a child who fails a grade and has to repeat it. What happens when a child fails a grade in school? Well, they have to repeat it until they pass, right? So in some way, failing grades in school delays graduation, right? For the children to go to university. That's why suicide is not recommended at all. It is always a lack of acceptance of God's will. And probably to be able to commit suicide, one has to have, well, a lesser spiritual understanding, right? Of what life is about, and why we're here. And because if we understand what it's all about, then of course our desire is not to commit suicide, but to navigate the course more effectively. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, right? To learn as much as possible, to graduate as soon as possible. For that, we know we have to go through difficulties because suffering is the price we pay for growth, right? Suffering only has two roots, right? A lack of acceptance of the will of God. You see, mental resistance to what happens or a lack of spiritual understanding can lead to that lack of acceptance, right? And those are the two roots of suffering. By committing suicide, we are not going to solve any problems. Suicide will only make us repeat the course, right? Which is also not a greater tragedy than that, because the universe will give us all the time we need. But in some way, if we delay spiritual growth, we perpetuate suffering, right? So it is not really the most intelligent thing to do, right? But it happens. And since it happens, we cannot say that it is outside the law of the universe, because otherwise it could not happen.
Thank you, Gonzalo. It's a pleasure to listen to you. Can I ask you another question? What does it say? Helena Garcia asked, is the pace of learning determined, and therefore the experiences we have to face? Or can we modify this pace and change the correspondences?
Yes, of course, we can modify the rhythm and change the correspondences through our dedication, our intention, and our spiritual practice. We can certainly modify it. We can modify it in the same way that A person who wants to learn to play golf or piano will go faster or slower depending on whether they have good teachers, for example. Whether one dedicates time to training, whether one dedicates intensity and intention, that's evident, right? As above, so below, as the saying goes, right? About spirituality, and therefore that's how it is, right? God already has all that planned, evidently, and we are not going to surprise him, but we must use our freedom to try in our own way, in the best possible way, increase the pace of our growth, make it as efficient as possible, right? Although here I must warn that sometimes the ego-driven desire, right, to grow spiritually very quickly can make it difficult for us, because we also have to leave that in the hands of God. The doing, the greater is, this is a bit similar when we see abundance, right? In the abundance session, we will see that the smartest thing we can do in life to be abundant is to always give the best of ourselves, but leave the results in the hands of God. If you remember about the session of previous of mystical consciousness and contemplation, we said there was active contemplation and passive contemplation, right? And that a better way to do active contemplation was to give the best of ourselves in everything we do, but leaving the results in the hands of God. Because when we want to control the results is when all the stress, anguish, etc. comes, not when we give the best of ourselves, right? Therefore, in spiritual growth, I believe the ideal attitude to go as fast as possible is to give the best of ourselves in it, right? But leaving the speed and those results in God's hand, and not insisting on wanting to be mystics tomorrow, not being impatient. If I tell you, well, we want to be mystics when God wills it. I don't know if I'm explaining myself. When it is the right moment for us, that doesn't mean we shouldn't give the best of ourselves to get there, right? But not to control it selfishly, because then we go against the law and make it difficult.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Gabi asks, she says, Gonzalo, but what are we really as people to need this learning or soul process?
Oh, let's see. What people are to me is clear, right? This is the only point that is a bit more controversial, isn't it? That I think it's one of the points Pablo referred to when he introduced the sessions, right? Where I differ a little, from Catholic doctrine in that sense. And maybe I am wrong, but it seems evident to me, right, with what we observe. I believe that we are souls, right? And souls that have a body to have a growth experience in the schools of the soul, which are the physical worlds, right? As Saint Basil said, and I have quoted so many times, right? Therefore, to the extent that we see ourselves more as souls and not as bodies or egos, we will have more inner peace. That is evident, right? We will experience spiritual growth much faster, and we will be able to resolve these in theory, mental difficulties, right? About why bad things happen to good people. If we see ourselves as bodies, we will never solve that. There's no solution. Now, if we see ourselves as souls, we can understand it perfectly, right? That is, many times the soul needs, doesn't it, harm to the body, well, to be able to grow more quickly, right? That is the purpose of many genetic diseases or many accidents or many things, isn't it? I think it is clearly explained in the gospel, and frankly, I don't understand how some thinkers have framed the issue differently, haven't they? I see the human being as a spirit incarnated in time, right? But of course, even the fathers and doctors of the church, like Saint Augustine or Saint Thomas and many others, have always said that the human being is more soul than body. It doesn't make sense to identify ourselves with that part of us, right? That is not permanent, is it? The body is temporary, as we all know, right? And therefore, what is permanent in us is the soul, right? The ego, it dissolves, doesn't it? With physical death. Then also in my conversations or in my reading with advanced mystics, I have always realized that as the level of mysticism advances, much less importance is given to the body. There are mystics who have even made the mistake of not caring for it, which is deep down a mistake no matter how mystical one may be, because the body is a great gift from God that we must value, care for, and respect, right? As a vehicle for the soul's learning in the physical worlds. But we should not identify with it, right? If we want to have inner peace, that's obvious, because let's say there are many things in the physical world that threaten the body, right? But they don't threaten the soul, right? As Jesus says in the gospel. Therefore, I think that's an idea about which we all need to reflect, right? And I insist, how do we know if it's true or not? If it isn't true, right? Well, I invite you to use the measuring stick of Jesus, right? By their fruits, you will know them. And I assure you that the less importance we give to the body, the more inner peace we will have. That is an experience that, please do not believe me, verify it for yourselves, right? And that's how it is, right? And therefore, well, everything that bears good fruit, I believe, is true, right? And I think this whole new paradigm of reality, well, it facilitates that understanding, doesn't it? Because otherwise, from the classical paradigm of classical science, it was much easier to think in terms of materiality, right? But although science will never approve of spirituality by itself, as I always said in the first session, it is true that science can create a mental context, right? Different regarding reality, where we can understand spirituality in a more rational way. That is also true, isn't it? Therefore, my answer to that is, what are we really? Souls that have incarnated in a body to take a course of learning. That's how I see the human being, okay? I think the children of God are the souls, not the bodies, right? Because if the children of God were the bodies, well, I don't think that God would treat them that way, right? I think that just look at how God takes care of the souls very well, right? I believe that bodies are not the children of God. Bodies are creations of God, so that souls have learning experiences, right? And well, that's my way of seeing it, and that's how I communicate it to you. And if I'm wrong, then I apologize. But I assure you that it has given me much more inner peace than thinking differently. You know, like I thought when I was young, when I was more materialistic, and it didn't go as well for me. Thank you. Gonzalo, one last question. Yes, please. There was whatever you want. Yes, yes, of course. Sure, whatever there is, whatever you want, I am at your disposal. What I don't want is to bore you with a little triviality. So you set the time, Juan, not me. Look, Mercedes Senabre asks, and why incarnate? We couldn't do all this without deceiving ourselves. Let's see. The question is already very good. But let's see. Let's extend that question to more issues if you want. Sometimes, believe me, I ask myself, hey, why did God make things this way? I ask myself that. For example, we observe animals and we see that in nature animals eat each other, right? And then, wow, that's cruel. Besides that, they must have a constant level of stress, right? Because you're either looking for something to eat or you're constantly watching to see who might come to eat you, right? So I say, why don't animals feed on the sun, right? For example, right? And all that predation chain would be unnecessary. Well, let's see. I understand that if God has made things this way, it's because it serves a purpose, even if my mind doesn't understand why. It must be that the only way to learn love in its entirety is to start from the ignorance of predation. I don't know if I make myself clear, you know? I also think that the different levels of consciousness correspond with different levels of violence, right? As we saw in the first session. For example, things I sometimes think, right? I say, well, if there are more advanced civilizations, and I have no doubt that there are, but I cannot prove it empirically, right? What would the animals in those civilizations be like if animals existed? I suppose they would all be more peaceful, that they would not eat each other, that the joint experience of animals and humans would no longer require violence, right? Or predation. But at this level of consciousness, it seems that it does, right? It is needed, of course. If I go out into the forest in the northern United States, I have to be careful that bears don't come because I could get a scare, right? Of course, in a more advanced civilization, that seems less necessary because they handle no level of violence, right? So the truth is that I have no answer. I mean, to answer that question, I would have to get inside the mind of God, right? And I am far from being able to do that. I can only say that we must observe reality, right? And that in reality, these events do occur. And if this is the case, it's because to learn love, right? At our levels of consciousness, well, those situations are necessary. The gospel tells us that they are. But why are they? Of course, I would like it if we didn't have to go through all these things for the children of God to learn love. And I suppose my grandchildren would also like to learn mathematics without having to go to school, right? Or make an effort. But they have to go to school, make an effort, make mistakes in the first equations, right? So only God knows why things are made this way. But what I do know is that God is love, God is omniscient, and therefore love and omniscience lead you to perfect efficiency, right? So if things could have been better or faster for spiritual evolution in another way, they would be different. I have no doubt about that, right? So, well, my mind and yours, well, we'll probably understand in the future, which I suppose will be better than now, why things have been done this way, right? But it must have a purpose of love behind it and must be the best way to grow spiritually, or we wouldn't be involved in these troubles, right? That's what I believe.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. We can wrap up the session here if you agree. Thank you very much for your explanations, for your reflections, for your talk. And we will meet next Thursday.
Well, I hope next Thursday will be important because I believe that the topic we will address might be the most important of all the sessions. However, I think we also needed the previous ones to reach Thursdays with a better understanding and to facilitate the acceptance we so much need.
Well, you all heard it. We can't miss next Thursday. Wonderful.
Thank you all very much and see you next Thursday. 1,000 thanks. 1,000 thanks to you.